Do you have to shut the doors, or do you just go and open new doors in new places like homes and coffee shops?
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest is Frank Wooden, and we'll be talking about whether or not you as a church planter or an existing church pastor might want to consider adopting the microchurch model. It's not right for every church, but it might be a way to look at church planting through fresh eyes, to bring new life into a dying church, and maybe even resurrect a dead one. Frank has been in pastoral ministry for over 40 years, and now he oversees church planting in Southern California and beyond. In this conversation, we talk about what the microchurch is, some cautions to be aware of, and how microchurch might be the answer for a lot of churches in crisis. Don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with a quick look at how the microchurch model might be an answer to some of the questions I've been asking of denominational leaders for the last several years. Well, Frank Wooden, my friend, welcome to the Church Lobby.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, you and I have known each other probably longer than any other guest I've had on. Let me see. I haven't had my wife or my parents or my sisters on. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
you
it's
and
been a
I have
couple of
known each
years.
other, since we were in Bible college. Since we were teenagers or at least early 20s, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, we graduated from the late, great Bethany Bible College, then Bethany College, then Bethany University. By the time it finally folded, it had made university status.
Yeah. And then we found our way down to Southern California, the promised land.
Yeah, and here we are and have been ministering in Southern California for a lot of years. In fact, for those of you who have read The Grasshopper Myth, you know a little bit about Frank because I mentioned some of the ministry he was doing at the time in San Diego, where they were opening neighborhood churches and so on. Your ministry has morphed as all of ours do over the years. So for those who don't know anything about your ministry, walk us through your walk of faith, your call to ministry, and how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah. So currently, I'm the church planning director for Plant SoCal, primarily planting churches in Southern California, but across the US and now internationally. But that role started for me, Karl, as I was a pastor here in San Diego. So some of the things that you've already alluded to, a smaller neighborhood church that all of a sudden had a vision that, hey, we could start and plant churches even though we're smaller. So we made a leap in our first year. We were planning on launching one church in a neighborhood here in San Diego. And through some unusual circumstances, we planted three churches that first year. It's not something I would recommend for the faint of heart, but it happened. One of those churches was in downtown Hollywood. One was in Spanish language. And from there, the next year we did two more. The following year we did three more. And at that point, I was asked to consider being a full-time church planning director. I'd kind of done it part-time as I was pastoring, but so nothing that I had really saw on the horizon leaving the local church as a pastor to go into church planning. But I've been doing that now full time for 8 years. It's been a very exciting time, a time of change. I think there's something that we can all relate to, no matter what size your church is, as far as reaching people that we're not reaching currently.
Yeah. Well, the last 8 years of church planting has been a very, let's just say, a little more change and transitional than most 8-year periods before. Yeah. So your concentration now is on the micro church, right?
So something that's kind of like a little sideline hobby interest of mine. I'm very much interested in trying to discern the times, like the men of Issachar in the Old Testament, understanding the times, knowing what to do. So
Mhm.
I've been watching coming out of COVID. I felt like what that pandemic did was probably accelerate for churches some things that were already being laid in motion. And an interesting thing happened to me going in through the pandemic. I ended up being on a Zoom, kind of like a Bible study without really having a leader, is more a discussion study with church planters literally across the United States, from the Northwest to Florida to the Midwest. And we were going through one of the Gospels, and the whole idea is you're just having a conversation. We're trying to envision being disciples with Jesus and what would happen. After we finished that, we enjoyed it so much, we went into the book of Acts. And something happened to me, Karl. Like, I've grown up in the church. I've preached on the book of Acts, studied it, taught on it, read on it, and read through it so many times. But for the first time, and probably because of this pace and this season, something occurred to me. I looked at the church at Jerusalem, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, this was the first mega church. They counted how many people got saved. We talk about connections, how many connection cards were turned in. And then you would think, well, that's a common narrative, but God used a persecution in the Roman Empire, just as I believe he used a pandemic for his purposes. And all of a sudden, from that point on, the church was scattered. It was more diverse. It was smaller. You never heard about 3,000 getting saved. You heard about so-and-so and their household getting saved and baptized. Yeah. And it occurred to me that, like if you had no familiarity with the book of Acts, and you were reading it for the first time, you might go, whatever happened to that big booming church in Jerusalem? And you thought it, disappeared, but it didn't, because they had a crisis and they had to have the Jerusalem Council. And, the mothership still existed. The apostles were still there. But what happened is God changed the narrative of Acts. He took the emphasis off of this mega church in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden he put it on this smaller expansion throughout the Roman Empire of smaller churches. And I just really resonated with me is what I'm seeing some of our struggle is how we do church in America, the increase of the nones, those who don't identify with anything as far as religiously. And I thought, what if God's changing the narrative again? What if the run of the mega church, the multi-site, what if it's not going to fade away, but what if God's shifting the focus onto something different? And I started to find that it resonated with more and more people. They were looking for something different in how church looked, smaller, more informal, more relational, casual. Not to say it can't happen in the building, but there's something that happens when we kind of shift that, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it tastes like.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. I mean, as much study as I've done on church size and going back to Acts 2 for it, it never hit me until you're just saying that right now. So you're right. It was this large size. A lot of them were visitors from other places, so they left. So there weren't 3,000 staying in Jerusalem afterwards. But nevertheless, it was huge. And
right.
We do have this tendency. If you start from Acts 2 and you go through the church, there is this constant tendency for us to want to build it bigger, and for God to bring usually persecution, or at least allow persecution, in order to continue to make it go to places that otherwise we would not willingly go, and to do it in ways that are smaller than we would want to be doing it. We're constantly building it big, and he's constantly pushing us back to small again.
Exactly. And I think with that, then you start to look for, in forecasting, they call it signals of change. Where do I see an example where this is happening? And conversations, certainly with millennials and Gen Zers, as much as we want to make what happens in the building better, by all means, we should do it with excellence, of course. And so we're always refining and perfecting and evaluating. But even if we had everything down perfectly in the church, there's just a whole segment of people who go, that's not for me. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
And, I have young adult kids, and our generation, Karl, we gave the world stadium rock concerts, right? That was our great contribution.
Yep.
Let's go to the Rose Bowl with 100,000 of my best friends and watch U2. And then I've got this son who will drive 2.5 hours out past Palm Springs to this small venue that's known for hosting these smaller bands and love it and thrive on it. And so there's something about that. And you start to look like San Diego is called a microbrewery capital of the United States, along with other places. But, the rise of that, you start to see these different connecting points. And I realized there is a group of people, certainly a younger group of people, that is looking at what church is or should be with a different set of eyes than my generation growing, if you grew up in church or you had church experience, was accustomed to.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I think there's one of the things I'm liking now, one of the trends I like in the church right now is we are finally, for the first time, maybe in my lifetime, at least open to the idea that let's have more than one tool in the tool belt, shall we? Let's not, right? We tend to do this. This is the answer right now. We want everybody on board. And there is, this generation particularly is really encouraging and even driving us to the point where we're realizing, hey, there's got to be more than one option for people because people are not all the same. So
Yeah.
right now we're talking about microchurch. So let's get into it because my emphasis is small church, but microchurch is not just another way of saying small church. It's a particular type of thing. So what's the big idea behind microchurch? What is it and why should we care about it?
Yeah, and language, I'm going to be one of the first ones to admit, I really think, an accelerated season of change. Our language is not keeping up with where we are. For example, another term we use a lot in church world right now is a hybrid approach to ministry. Oh, we're in a building and we're online or whatever. And again, I don't know that's the best term, and I'm not sure micro is the best term. We use it descriptively, but sometimes there's a pejorative about it, and that, well, if it's micro, it's not as good. It's deficient in some way. It hasn't fully reached its potential. But the idea of microchurch, and I know people who will say this far better than me, but I'm going to just kind of say it in, though I'm in ministry, kind of layman's terms, is that I think of it's church. It has all the elements of church. So this is not if we just renamed our small groups or life groups microchurches, not unless you're content in leaving people in those places and not expecting them to show up on Sunday morning in your church building. So it's fully church. And there's a lot of different ways it can look like. Some are sermon based, some are ministry based. But the idea is that it's very relational, very conversational. So I'm looking at it as the skill set for a microchurch pastor. And I'm going to use that term pastor, although
Right.
more likely than not, they're not going to look like you and I, having grown up being professional clergy with credentials and so forth, and maybe a lot of Bible school training. These will more likely be bivocational people who just have a calling to reach people that are not being reached currently. It's like I said, more relational. I think in a lot of ways, I'm answering your question, just trying to be descriptive, and I know
Sure.
it's kind of an awkward way of doing it, but I'm trying to create a picture. I think of I'm in a home, I'm in a coffee shop. I know some that are actually meeting outdoors in parks in Southern California because you can do that, but they're reaching people because the key thing is it's not, sometimes in small groups we become kind of so attached to each other that we close ourselves off. But in a microchurch, the idea is that we're always reaching the person that's not here. So I'm always looking at the idea, is there somebody who needs to be here? And I'm building on normal conversation, relational conversations, where someone might say, I don't really want to go to your church. I'm kind of skeptical about the whole church thing. How about if you went to church, but it didn't feel as churchy to you,
Mm-hmm.
where you could sit down, be a skeptic, but be accepted even as a skeptic. Ask your hard questions, but do it in a way as though we're just a group of people who are gathered around. And you know what? Reality is, we all have some questions. We don't have it all figured out. And anytime we represent ourselves as having understood it all, I think we're failing a generation that is really looking for authenticity, or even an older generation that's looking for authenticity, but feels to a certain degree, I'm missing that. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at this group as, I don't think it needs to be, I'm not planning a sermon. I may not even be really planning a super deep Bible study. It may be discovery Bible study where we're just talking about the passage. What do you learn about Jesus? What do you learn about people? What could be a takeaway this week from what you're reading? I think ideally that's where microchurch can grow and thrive. And I think of this audience that, for one, it's this audience that they're in your community. You could have a smaller church in a city of 1 million, or a smaller church in a city of 10,000, or anywhere in between. And as you have your church, or church of any size, there is a segment of people, they're not going to come. How do we go to them? How do we go to where they are? And I think this can be a way where I show up on your turf. I show up in your community, in your neighborhood, in your pub, in your, coffee shop. I'm bringing myself to a place where I enjoy this, but I'm not trying to bring you into my world. We're sharing our worlds
Right.
together in a comfortable way.
Okay. So from what I'm hearing, let me see if I can summarize it and just reflect back to see if I'm hearing what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it correctly. So we're talking about intentionally small, intentionally relational,
Yes.
intentionally conversational,
Yes.
intentionally evangelistic,
Yes.
and
Intentionally simple too. I would add that
oh,
in there.
okay. Yeah. I was trying to come up with the right word, but that's yeah.
Yeah. My son has been intrigued by this whole idea of microchurch and hasn't launched one yet, but is very interested. But I'm finding I'm actually talking to pastors who have young adult kids, and they're going like, man, my son, daughter, whoever never, expressed any interest in going into ministry. It wasn't that they hated ministry. It's just they didn't want to do ministry the way they saw it. They didn't want to be, when you start to think what it takes to do a church of any size, you're preparing sermons, you almost always have an element of worship, you have kids ministry, you're doing hospitality. That's just at, the service part of things. Then you've got to worry about, utilities and insurance, and if you own a
Mhm.
property, maintenance and mowing the lawn and all of that stuff. And it's like, none of that appeals to a certain degree. And
Yeah.
they're going like, wait, I could just meet, in my backyard or whatever, and we could have a barbecue, and we could and we could have. It's like, and it's not church light. I don't think you're missing anything. As a matter of fact, I think you enhance a lot of things that could be missed.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden now, that's a little bit attractional. It's like, oh, and I think
Yeah.
here's what I think too, Carl. In all of our churches, I would say of all sizes, and I think I see a lot of my larger church friends wrestling with this now, is there are people in our church. I think the answer to the Great Commission is the people that are obviously in our church. I deal with church planning. I know church planning directors. We're all praying for workers of the harvest. I think they exist. I think they're sitting in churches, and I think they just don't necessarily want to do the model that's been presented before
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, I fully agree. One of the most frequent conversations I'm having in the last couple of years, post-pandemic, basically, with small church pastors. It used to be needing encouragement, and then it used to be, I want some tools that are different from the big church ones, and that's still there. But the primary thing that I'm hearing right now, quite frankly, is I don't know how long we can sustain this church given our recent downturn in attendance, because we can't afford it anymore. And
Yeah.
my kind of go-to response to that is, our problem isn't that we can't afford church. We just can't afford the structures that we've built up around it anymore. And so microchurch intentionally takes those expensive structures apart, or simply doesn't use those expensive structures at all. Is that an accurate representation of what I'm hearing from you?
Very much so. I think, like in the church planning world, every church planning organization has a process. And when I've looked at all the different approaches to church planning, whether it's go to an assessment center, or, you're going to have to follow this particular model of launch large, or whatever it might be, I realize every method has a choke point where it slows things down. And
Mhm.
in order to fulfill the Great Commission, we've got to reverse the funnel. It can't be shrink it down to this. We've got to flip. We've got to blow this thing open.
Right.
So this is a logical way of really going into all the world, by going into every neighborhood and really doing something powerful. And I think it empowers people. I think it fits right in the paradigm of like you allude to, smaller congregations struggling to maintain facilities, struggling to keep, every area staffed with volunteers, et cetera, et cetera. Not that you and I are against any of that. And I could even foresee if an existing church, and we'll talk about that, I think, more in a little bit here, but if an existing church started microchurches, had several, I believe probably inevitably, if you had maybe 1 out of every 10 microchurches, you're going to get this, we don't know what to do. We're meeting in our living room. We outgrew it. We're meeting out in the covered patio. We're outgrowing that. What should we do? Now, if it was a life group in the old days, we would have said, oh, we have to divide. But it might be, well, you know what? You may be the anomaly. Maybe we do need to help you find a building. That's not the worst thing that could happen. If that were to take place, it's not the goal, but it could happen.
Yeah, you see, I love that because that is such a complete 180 shift of mindset towards something that I think is better. Because the old mindset for church planting was, if you don't hit a critical mass of 200 within X number of years, then there's no way your church is going to be able to make it, because you've got these structures in place that have to be paid for, and that's only considered a legitimate church unless you hit these particular benchmarks. The microchurch idea turns that model completely on its head and says, no, we're intentionally small. We're intentionally going to be just hanging out in this coffee shop or in this house or whatever. And the anomaly, as you just put it, of 1 out of 100 maybe that just does get too big for that. Okay, now how do we deal with this really different, weird thing of it's too big to fit in these small places anymore? And then you address the size not as a problem exactly, but as, to use the word anomaly again, as an anomaly that we've got to figure out now, rather than as the norm that if you don't hit it, somehow you've failed.
Right.
That reversal, I think, all of a sudden takes so much burden and so much pressure off. And then I think puts the emphasis in the right place, which is, are we helping people grow in their faith? Are we reaching a community? Are we answering questions that they can't get answered anywhere else? And if all those answers are yes, yes, and yes, then the numerical increase simply isn't part of the equation that we worry about. It's something we address if it happens to occur.
Yes. I 100% agree.
Yeah. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are 2 things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. So here's a question I've got that I guarantee you several listeners, especially if their pastors, are concerned about, and legitimately so. So what are some cautions to be aware of? Because earlier you talked about, okay, so the person who's leading it, let's call them a pastor for now, but most of the time they won't be a pastor with pastoral training, and immediately red flags go up, and understandably so. How do we stop this from turning into, some group of people who just are offering their off the top of their head opinions, which half the times are going to turn into something that's not biblical at all? So what are some of the cautions we need to be aware of, and how do we address that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you're right. There's always the potential for something to go sideways, although I wouldn't want the fear of that to stop us from exploring it. But how can we minimize that? How can we reduce that? Certainly valid. So the way I see it is, if I'm in a church and I'm a pastor of it, and we're going to go start a microchurch as another expression for whatever reason, I want to have a very, very strong connection with that microchurch pastor. Matter of fact, that's going to be the requirement, is that we are in accountability with each other, that we are in regular, call it training, meeting, fellowship. Envision a large church with a staff, and how they would meet, maybe even weekly, debrief, plan, etc. I don't know that it has to be every week, but I think it certainly has to be very consistent regularly, because that's the connection. I wouldn't want somebody to be out there falling apart either and just going like, I thought this was going to be a piece of cake, and it actually, it's not a guaranteed success. There can be struggles. So I think that's the key thing, is me staying connected with the microchurch pastor. And when I've done some research with existing churches that have done this and done this well, that's the key thing. They don't put necessarily a lot of rules and regulations on what kind of outreaches can you do, or are you doing sermon based, or are you doing a book of the Bible, or how are you, there's a more flexibility there, but very strong connection with that microchurch pastor. And I think that's essential.
Okay, so the primary model I'm hearing you talk about is that an existing church plants some microchurches. First of all, how is that different from the multi-site model?
Well, let's kind of take it back. You may start a microchurch, or you may end up starting what I would call a microchurch network, because one may not be enough. One inevitably can lead to two or three, because you start to see other locations, or you pinpoint, we've got a pocket of people over here, there's another group over there. So it can be, and using, again, terminology that probably needs to be revised and updated, I guess we can consider it multi-site. I would look at it as a network. I think when we tend to use that word multi-site, we're thinking of larger churches that have buildings in various different locations. And so this is shrinking the scale down. Call it microsite, and multi-site. However, whatever you want to do. I don't know if there's a right way or a wrong way, but it could be that, yes.
Okay, so we've got what I'm hearing is the microchurch where somebody decides to just simply start a microchurch out of their own. That was kind of my perception off the top of my head, but your primary approach is that an existing church starts microchurches, or are both of those models in play right now? And if so, what would the differences be and how those would be approached?
Both are in play. I think here's a caveat. If I were to encounter somebody who says, I want to do the microchurch model, I'm not part of an existing church that will be connected to, because I've encountered, even way before microchurch kind of rose up, and I know we used to use the expression house church to describe it. So way back in the day, I very rarely saw this succeed, because what ended up happening, there was not a multiplying of leadership. So here's a microchurch pastor, and they meet in a home on a Wednesday night, and then the same microchurch pastor now is leading in a different location a group on a Friday or on a Sunday. And ideally, for this to really achieve its potential, you want to be multiplying leaders, so that if you are doing that, it doesn't just stop at, it's all me. Because again, I think this is one of the beauties of it. So often in church world, it is based on the lead pastor, and that person is the key to keeping all of this humming. So I don't want to see that replicated in the microchurch model. I'm not even sure it's great in the larger church model. I think there needs to be more of a team approach, but I want to see a replication of leaders. I want that point person to be working with all of those potential microsite pastors. So whenever I have somebody who said, hey, I'm running a microchurch, if you did a microchurch and it stopped at one and it's you and 10 or 12 people, that's amazing. I'm all for that. I want to put my, not that it needs my blessing, but I do want to bless and look at that, because I think that is the kingdom of God being fulfilled. But I think so many times when I'm now talking with microchurch pastors or planters who want to do this, their vision is not micro. I love their vision. They're going into big cities and they're going like, I want to reach this city, and I know it's going to take maybe dozens or hundreds of microchurches. So we all have a different approach to it, different capacity, different way of looking at it. But collectively, the reality is, you and I, we do the math. If you have a mega church of 2,000 and it's doing a great, really fulfilling the mission, and then it would take 10 churches of 200 to reach the same number of people, right?
Right.
Both can be perfectly fine. Well, now we take it to a microchurch. You're talking churches of, say, 20 or less, then you've got to multiply it out that much more.
Gotcha. So we've been talking about the individual microchurch. We've been talking about a church launching a microchurch or two or several. But here's my question. Again, because I talked to so many small church pastors and a lot of them that are struggling, and a lot of them are struggling, as I said already, simply to maintain the structure. And maybe there's a small church pastor hearing this right now and going, is there a way then to take my traditional church in a traditional building and transition it to become a microchurch? Is that even a possibility?
I certainly believe so. And that's see, again, back to that word hybrid, that could be a new hybrid way of doing it, which this is when it comes to doing church, I think it's a very permission granting season where a lot of the guardrails that were self-imposed, like you got to go in this narrow lane of how to do church. Now those guardrails are being pushed out. So I think there's a lot of freedom and flexibility. I think a building can be a blessing, or in some cases, it can be a curse, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And
I've seen a lot
then
of
we
that.
look at it as, like, well, I'm stuck with this big building. I guess, we're going to need to shut our doors, and, we've seen that, and church building gets sold or whatever. It's like, well, do you have to shut the doors, or do you just go and open new doors in new places
Yeah.
like homes and coffee shops or whatever?
Here's what I'd like to do for the bonus material. Let's spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about how an existing small church can change from a standard institutional church model into a microchurch model. Let's walk through some of the steps of that. So listeners, if you are interested in transitioning an existing small church into a microchurch model, you can get the bonus content. If you are a current subscriber or supporter, you'll be getting our weekly newsletter, and you'll have the link in that. If you don't get that yet, you can get it very easily. Just go to karlvaters.com/subscribe, and you can get the newsletter for free. Or if you want to become a partner, go to karlvaters.com/support, and all of our partners get the weekly free link to all the bonus material as well. So we'll talk about that for 5 or 10 minutes in the bonus material, and you'll get that extra help. But before we get towards the end of this and get to the lightning round, I know you have a list of 3 reasons microchurch works for a church of any size, because your heart, just like mine, has always been drawn towards the small church, and everything you do, just like everything I do, always keeps the small church in mind. And so you're not just looking at, hey, the big church can now launch 10 microchurches. You're talking about a church of any size. So what are those 3 reasons that microchurch works for a church of any size?
Yeah, we touched on the first one, which is there's always going to be any community of any size. There's an element of people that have been turned off by, I'll just use the generic term, traditional church or prevailing model of church. So this is an alternative approach that will reach a certain demographic of people. And I think they can exist in a small town to a big city. I'm not going to, the building. I don't care how great it is. I'm not going there. So that's the first one. Second one is, I think there are smaller pockets of people that we identify, well, here's a kind of like a little bit of a further reach away community. But it's a small area, it's a small pocket of people. And we've thought about starting a church, or sometimes it's like, hey, well, remember about 12 years ago, someone so went in and tried to start a church in that area. And, it seemed to be going good for about a year and a half, and then it closed because they tried to do the prevailing model. So I can identify a smaller pocket of people, and I was going like, well, if we made a connection there, we could do a microchurch approach, whereas a large church kind of, meeting in a building and all the things that go with that, it would be a step too far. Third group of people, and this would require the right microchurch pastor leader, is there's this demographics. Usually I'm thinking like an ethnic group where it's a smaller pocket of people. So like you and I are both in Southern California. So there are a large number of Spanish-speaking churches, because Spanish-speaking people are a large part of our population. But you might identify a group of Arabic-speaking people, or we just actually launched a church for Sri Lankan people.
Hmm.
And it's a microchurch. It's meeting in several locations because of the smaller pocket of people there. And it would
Right.
have been, not every place can, there are Arabic churches in Southern California, but they're not as common. Not every place needs to have that. We need to meet in in a building. So I think you can identify a demographic group that, again, primarily ethnic, that is smaller in its size. And then, I want to throw this out too, Karl, because I think this is an interesting, I haven't seen it yet, but I think it can happen. We've all, if we've pastored probably any length of time, we've probably had a couple, an individual, a family that had to move away for whatever reason. And, they're crying. It could be they've been in the military, being transferred, or just a job relocation or whatever. They're crying because they love the church, and our kids will never find a church as good as this one. And you're sad because their tithe walked out the door, but they were also involved in ministry. They were such a great supporter. And I'm thinking, if I had a church and we had microchurch expression in our community, so that our church people that met at the building could see this and know what it was like, and wrap their head around it, I think there can be some circumstances where somebody says, we're going to go off, and you just know this is a spiritually mature couple. They know how we do life. What if you took our church with you? What if you
Mm.
went, and wherever you got transferred to, you started a church in your home?
Yeah.
We'll do this connection. We'll stay
Yeah. Yeah.
connected. And listen, their tithe didn't walk away. And maybe once a year you do a big sell, you pay for them, their flights to come back, and you have they're part of a leadership emphasis day or whatever. And I started thinking, like, I'm in a military town, a Navy town, San Diego. What if
Oh,
they
yeah.
went to Dubai or wherever in the world, and they started a micro church there? I mean, you could be
Yeah.
global and stay connected. And those
Yeah.
transition times of moves oftentimes are where church life tends to kind of go sideways sometimes.
I love that idea because a geography means far less than it used to because internet. We can keep
Yep.
those connections alive. You can do things really legitimately that way. And people now don't see these internet connections as less than. And so we can connect, we can continue to train. You're not waiting for a letter to show up or an expensive phone call. They can be a
Yep.
part of your training session every week with your other microchurch pastors just as much as if they were in the room. And now it's got me thinking about the flip side of that. Just like they can, because it's transitional, they're going somewhere else and they can start something. It seems to me that the microchurch model opens itself up for the possibility of a church for a specific period of time, so that maybe there's an influx of a particular ethnic group, but it's only for the next 2 years while there's a particular emigration from a particular area, or there's
Hmm.
persecution in an area. And so you've got it to help them assimilate. And then after a while, that emigration stops. And so once they've assimilated into it, and you're not intentionally trying to make them assimilate necessarily, but you're helping them with the transition. And then once you get to the point where you're going, you know what, we don't need this anymore because this transition has already happened and it's gone, that you haven't built up a structure that you have to continue to support. And you can go, okay, we don't need it now. So we had a microchurch that lasted for 3 years that helped people through this
Yep.
particular season of their life. And there's no loss that it finished because we did the job that we intended to do. And that can't
Yep.
happen with a traditional church where you got to have a building and a paid pastor and
Yeah.
so on.
Yep.
There's so many
Exactly.
possibilities. The nimbleness of this is one of the things that I really appreciate to that. And again, before we get to the lightning round, if someone is interested in exploring these ideas further, where should they start? Is there something they should read? Is there a place that you can send them that they can start getting some ideas about how to look further into this?
There are some resources out there. They've gained national prominence, but they have excelled in a microchurch model in a larger city. One is called the Kansas City Underground. So I think if you just Google KC, Kansas City Underground, also the Tampa Underground, Tampa, Florida. So
Okay.
both of these have great resourcing websites, information there that you can turn to and look towards. I would say those are great starting places. But another thing I would encourage your listeners to kind of become versed in is that discovery Bible study method. And if you're not familiar with it, again, that you can Google Discovery Bible Study Method. And it's a very, very simple process of going through a passage of scripture with a group of people. I did this actually during the pandemic when we were meeting in our home. And I had daughter-in-laws who hadn't grown up in church, and they thrived in this because it was put everybody kind of on a level playing field. They grew so much in their knowledge about God and his word because it was very simple, very practical. And it lends itself well to kind of like a microchurch, informal, but evangelistic approach to getting people acquainted with God's word.
Great. We'll put links to all of that in the show notes for everybody. All right, let's get to the lightning round questions for you, Frank.
Yeah, go for it.
First of all, what are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to it?
So I was thinking about this change, and I would say the biggest change is the pace of change. That's what I've noticed, is that what could be static in ministry for a number of years now might be static for a much shorter period of time. And I don't think it's necessarily fads. I just think it's our culture that we're in. So I don't think that, like I got to change how I preach every 2 years or something. It's not that. It's just that we need to be aware of where culture is going and it's how it rapidly is changing, then wrap our heads around it so that we can engage culture and where it's at and in their approaches. So I think that's the biggest thing I would say is be tuned in to the pace of change. And if you're fighting something that, well, I wish we could go back to where it was 10 years ago, we're not even going to go back to where it was 4 years ago. So, that's a mistaken notion. I want to know, like, where do I need to be today, but also where do I need to be a year or two from now?
Yeah, absolutely. Fast pace. Second question, what free resource like an app or a website has helped you lately that you'd recommend for small church ministry?
All right. So I gave some thought to this one. And here's the thing. I'm really leaning into trying to understand the times. And I think this key word is innovation. And so I'm going to give you an author who passed away not that many years ago, but he was a professor at Harvard. His name is Clayton, Clayton Christensen, SEN at the end, Clayton Christensen. He's written a number of books. Matter of fact, one of them is here on my desk right now, The Innovator's Solution. And while these were written from a business perspective, I have found myself, I've been a fan of his for probably 10 years or more. But what I've done, Karl, is I've started to read him more again lately because one of the things he's helping me to see is the need to continually be innovative. And I work with church planners, and church planners think they're the most innovative people on the face of the planet because they're going to go out and start something where nothing exists. But sometimes all they want to do is just make a little tweak to the model they've seen. And is it really an innovation? And I'm looking at what is a thing that happens, you can't resist it, is disruption. And so disruptive theory, and it's a God thing. So it's not like, somebody came up with a business principle, we need to be disruptors. It's a God thing. God disrupts all the time. Mm-hmm. So I want to lean into disruption, not be afraid of it. And I want to encourage us. This will help us to navigate, obviously, a very interesting season. I'm trying to avoid using the word season all the time. So era, whatever you want to go. But we're in this, and it's very kind of like it throws us off a little bit. It's like a little unsteady, but to lean into it, to embrace it. That's what I want you to get out of this.
Gotcha. And you're trying to avoid using the word season while you live in the one place in the contiguous United States that has the least turnaround of seasons of all. San Diego has no seasons.
No, it's true. Very true.
All righty. Next, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
Early on in my ministry, the man, William Vickery, great leader in NorCal when I was young. Way before my time should have happened, I was asked to be an interim pastor at a church that had a struggle. And it was my church. So I just was promoted in this role of interim pastor. He met with me veteran minister, and he gave me these words. And when I share this, I want you to understand it's not a racial type of thing, but he used the term black sheep and white sheep. And so
Right.
black sheep being a representative of cantankerous, contentious people, white sheep being, more amenable followers of Jesus Christ. And he said, there are black sheep in this congregation and there are white sheep in this congregation. Your job is to shepherd all of them. And I've never forgotten it. And as much as black sheep, contentious people who are rebellious and hard-headed and all that, my job is still to be a shepherd of those people.
Yeah. Because even the black sheep aren't goats.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
Exactly. Finally, what's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
All right. So I'm going to go back to the church planter analogy. Church planters are the most amazing people. And sometimes they just make me, slap my head and wonder, like, how did you get this far? But again, this whole thing of innovation, thinking that they are the most innovative people on the face of the planet. We're going to go out and win our community. We're going to do it. And I've had multiple ones. I had one church planter. I was in their kind of launch team meeting with their team, months before they were going to launch, and how we're going to do an outreach and make people aware of us. And we're going to go to the park and we're going to do a movie in the park. And that's not super innovative, but it's a great idea. And they said, and we're going to go show the Passion of the Christ. Remember that movie, The Passion of the Christ, and, intense. And, it's like,
yeah.
And I'm going, no, do not do the Passion of the Christ. Show a Disney film. Do something that parents and their little kids will want to come to. Don't do it. So, it's just like sometimes do things that we don't think. I had another church planter, probably had about $10,000 in his bank account. And he wanted to go put it towards an LED wall in a rented facility. I'm going, no, just
in a rented facility.
Do not do that. Do not take your last $10,000 and get an LED wall. So, every time you run into somebody who sounds like they're super innovative, sometimes they need a good gut check.
Yeah, it sounds like if you're overseeing a whole bunch of microchurch pastors, you might face that a lot too. So.
Yep.
How can people find you online if they'd like to follow up with anything you've talked about today?
The best way, Karl, is I do a newsletter, comes out twice a month. It's my Plant SoCal newsletter, but a lot of it is geared towards bigger picture things, not just what Plant SoCal is doing.
Okay.
And if anybody wanted to email me, I'll make sure they get added to the list, and it's fwooden@socalnetwork.org. And I know you got that link, but If you just said, add me to your newsletter, I'd love to. It's been now going out across the US and into Europe. And I think you'd find it helpful no matter what size your church is. So love to help you out in that way.
Yeah, great. We'll put a link to that in the show notes for sure. Frank, thank you so much for this. We're going to go into the bonus material. So anybody who's interested in Frank to help you walk through the steps of how do you take an existing small church and transition it into becoming a microchurch. We're going to take a few minutes to talk about that in the bonus material. You get it again by going to karlvaters.com/support or karlvaters.com/subscribe, right? Yeah, I got that right. Either way, you'll get the free newsletter every week, and the links to all of the bonus material is always in there every single week. Frank, thank you so much for your help today.
Absolutely.
Well, for years now, I've been talking to church leaders and especially denominational officials about being more proactive about considering the viability of the house church and the microchurch model. I think that melding the two together, the microchurch with denominational oversight, can help to moderate a couple of the concerns, primarily the theological ones that we have about these types of churches. But also, I'm convinced if every denomination supported a microchurch network, it would be easier for people who want to worship in that way to find a church near them that they can rely on. So, as we said earlier, the microchurch model isn't for everyone. But one of the things I love most about it is that it allows us to see church through a different set of lenses than the get more people in the room lens that we're used to looking through. It forces us to think more relationally, more conversationally, and maybe, I think hopefully, more biblically. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.